He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They told investors that the brand was a successful brand overseas and a factory was going to open up in Auckland and they would produce these products. But of course, they never did. And the real intention was to scam the investors, take the money and run.
Hi, I'm Jesse Mulligan, and today on Crimes NZ, we go back 60 years to investigate one of New Zealand's biggest fraudsters. In 1966, a Salvation Army captain was steering a barge up Waitematā Harbour when he spotted a mysterious suitcase floating in the water. So began the investigation into the activities of Robert Gardner. Joseph Sheehan BEM is a retired JP and former national head of the New Zealand Police's intelligence section. But in the 60s, he was a detective sergeant on this case.
It was Friday the 17th of June 1966. As you said, the Salvation Army officer was steering up the Waitematā Harbour by Browns Island when he noticed a suspicious suitcase floating in the water. Now, at that time, the Salvation Army had two islands in Auckland. One was Aotearoa and the other was Motoroa.
Yeah.
They were inebriates' homes. Drunkenness was an offence, and if you appeared before the magistrate on multiple times, you were sent down to the island to dry out.
Wow.
Every Monday, they transported the prisoners to and from the island, and it was on the boat Mahoe that Captain Medlands was on. When he arrived at the Wharf Police Station, he unloaded his prisoners, and he had found the suitcase which he had picked up. When he arrived at the Wharf Police Station, he unloaded the prisoners, and then he started to make a couple of phone calls as to the names that he had found in the suitcase on documents. And he got in touch with a young lady called Paulette Moran. She was the office lady at Leedram and Hartnell. Now, going back a step, we did a study to find out how this suitcase got into the water.
Yeah.
With the harbour master, we worked out that the suitcase had probably been thrown in the water at about 8:30 p.m. the previous night from Oraki Wharf. Now, it had drifted up under the harbour bridge. The tide had changed and it swept it down the Waiheke Channel, and this is where Captain Medlands picked it up. Now, Jesse, that was probably one in millions of a chance to find that small suitcase.
Yeah, pretty amazing work that you were able to do to work out where it had come from in the first place.
Yes, it was. What happened after that, at about 2 p.m. the same afternoon, Paula Moran rang me at the police station, and she said that she had brought the suitcase from Captain Medlands and given it to one of the office managers, a guy called McGurgan, who was her boss.
Yes, I understand. And they realised there was something dodgy going on, did they?
Yes, they quickly found out that everyone involved had either fled the country or was about to leave the country. And so we got on the phone also and found that a guy called Robert Gardner, who was known as Skip, had already gone the day before, and one of his cohorts, a warrant chaplain, who was also an employee and in on the scheme, had also left for Australia that morning.
Not usually a sign that things are above board, hey?
Well, what actually went on to transpire that Gardner was a actual serial swindler who had masterminded several schemes of this nature around the world.
Wow.
He was known under 17 different names and was wanted by Interpol in numerous countries. Now, Gardner had been working in Australia running a similar style scheme, and he also had promised to bring into Australia Russian tanks and hovercraft for the Australian government. But his cosmetic company over there failed, so he needed a new place to try again. And that's when he got the idea to bring Leedram and Hartnell franchise to New Zealand.
And what was their scheme?
Well, their scheme, it was to buy cheap cosmetics and sell them through franchisees to dairies, because pharmacies and supermarkets were the only place that sold cosmetics in those days. Now, Leederman Hartnell started in January 66, and this was actually at that time a new type of doing business that we hadn't come across in New Zealand. But of course, with all the loopholes in franchising, it was good for scammers to take advantage of this.
Right. What did they tell investors?
Well, they told investors that the brand was a successful brand overseas and a factory was going to open up in Auckland, and they would produce these products. But of course, they never did. And the real intention was to scam the investors, take the money and run.
How much money did he end up defrauding customers of, do you know?
Gardner, or through Leederman Hartnell, stole £86,700. We were lucky enough to recover £59,000, so the loss was kept down to about 27. Now, he was charged with £62,500 when he came to court.
A lot of money.
Money back. We were able to do that through a share broker he was using. So he had predated checks that he was going to swoop on and clean out in Australia, but of course we had those stopped before he could do anything with them.
That's good news. And what about the suitcase that was dumped in the harbour? What did you find in there?
Well, all the office documents were in the case. There were the agreements, the bank statements, investor information, the distributor information. The dumping of it was left to Noel McGurgan and his other partner in business, Patricia Keane, and she was a high-class sex worker. Now, Noel was instructed to weigh the case down with a brick and throw it in the harbour the night before, but of course he forgot to put the brick in.
So it floated?
Yes. What actually happened was, of course, with all the air out of the suitcase with the volume of documents in it, the suitcase floated and down the harbour it went. Now, there were previous similar scams that had been running in Australia under Leederman Hartnell franchise also about this time. But, of course, the promises that they had made to the customers over there, the banks were getting nervous in Australia. So the alarm bells started to ring. So Gardner and his associates thought, well, look, we better get out of New Zealand now while the getting was good. So that's how the suitcase came to be dumped in the harbour.
Yeah, I mean, of all the way they dumped the records, that must have been one of the worst ideas.
Yes.
There's another name here, Murray Stewart Riley. Where does he fit into the story?
Now, Riley was a corrupt detective sergeant who worked in Sydney.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, Riley was an Olympic rower and a double Commonwealth gold medalist.
Wow.
At the time, the taking of New Zealand £1 notes out of New Zealand were easy to cash overseas. And it was a common move for swindlers to do this and take them out in large sums of notes. Now, as the distributors' monies came in to Gardner's account, they would change them into £1 notes and then take them out on the plane. And corrupt police, such as Riley, would help them through customs and other areas in Australia.
Gee. So how did you catch up with this scheme of Riley's?
Well, at the end of June the same year, 66, after Gardner's associates had been caught in New Zealand, a phone call came through to the New Zealand police to Graham Perry. Now, Graham was my detective inspector and my boss virtually.
Yeah.
Riley called Graham Perry and said that he had been given his name as a person who could help him to arrange bail for Patricia Keane and Noel McGurgan. Graham was told that if he arranged the bail, there would be $400 in cash on the meat and another $5,000 split between them when bail was arranged.
That's an audacious phone call to make, really, when you don't know who you're calling.
Oh, absolutely. Well, of course, Graham told me about this phone call, and we decided that we would call him back and record his messages that he gave us. Then we suggested that perhaps he get on an aeroplane and come over and we could do a deal.
Wow.
But, of course, what actually happened when Graham picked him up and the meet was at the top of Queen Street, Graham gave us a signal, and another detective, Norm Souter, and I went over and pulled Riley out of the back of the car, handcuffed him and took him off to the police station.
That would have been one of the more exciting days at work for you, wouldn't it?
Well, at the end of the day, he was jailed for 9 months, so it was quite effective.
And I imagine it would have made news back in Australia too.
Oh, yes, it did. It caused several ripples.
So what about Gardner, Robert Gardner? This is the guy who's sort of the architect of the whole scheme. He was obviously moving around countries pretty easily, pretty successfully.
Yes, well, when Gardner got back to Australia, he had then skipped again off to where we didn't know at the time. But it was finally found that he had gone from Australia via LA to London. And we then sent a message through Interpol to see if they can find him. And they actually traced him to an address in London. And then we got Scotland Yard to keep an eye on him to see whether he was coming and going, while we got charges before the court in New Zealand to get warrants out to extradite him from England to New Zealand.
Okay, let's come back to him, because there's all these other people involved as well. One of whom is Warren Chaplin. Remind me, what was Warren's part in it?
Warren Chaplin was a partner of Gardner in Australia and helped him on the Leedham and Hartnell side of the business there.
On the scam.
Before they came to New Zealand. So he was in on the scheme when he came to New Zealand.
So is it true that you flew over there to try and get him extradited?
Yes. I flew to Australia, and while I was there, we had the case to extradite Chaplin back to New Zealand, but the case failed. And it failed on the basis that Chaplin said he was just a pawn in the business and he was used by Gardner. So there was nothing I could do about it but come back to New Zealand.
Did you meet the sex worker Patricia Keane over there, or he had something to do with her as well?
Yes, on the last night before I was ready to come back to New Zealand, Patricia Keane rang me and she invited me out for dinner on the basis of no hard feelings, Joe. We'll have a couple of drinks before you go home. But I felt she was trying to trap me in some way.
Yeah, that wouldn't be normal, would it, for someone who'd been under suspicion and you'd been attempting to extradite to invite you over for a dinner?
No, it was a little bit unusual. But however, I accepted the invitation on the basis that I would buy the drinks and we would have dinner. But of course, I had singles and I bought her doubles. After a while, she decided she wanted to go to the loo. So she put a handbag down and a shawl and left it on a chair. And off she went. Now, while she was away, I had a look in the handbag. And there I saw a telegram which was signed Skip. And it had a telephone number on top of it, which I memorised. And, of course, what happened then, I left immediately after that dinner and got hold of New Zealand, and we got on Interpol and traced where the call had come from. And it had been from a phone in London, but it had been discovered by this time that Gardner had left LA and gone to London.
Now, you're obviously using a lot of your skills here, Joe. You're playing it straight with this dinner guest. When she leaves, you're quickly going through her bag looking for clues, and then you have to memorise the phone number. That's all, it's pretty cinematic stuff, I've got to say. It would make a good screen movie.
Well, those days, communications were different. Most of them were on what we call ticker tape. And phone calls had to be sent through a system where they were downloaded and resent on, such as a telegram was sent by phone. You could trace back through the number.
Yeah, incredible. You're talking to Interpol and talking to Scotland Yard, and what do you hear from them?
Well, once we found him in London, we laid charges in New Zealand and got warrants out under the Future Defenders Act to get him transferred back to New Zealand, which, by the way, was our first extradition to London. But what actually happened was that when we locked him up, the offences we charged him with weren't crimes in England, and a false pretense in New Zealand, as long as there was an intention to deceive, our law said that we could lock the person up and charge him. That couldn't happen in England. So there was a standoff legally, and I had to leave England in a hurry and fly back to New Zealand to get new information laid in the court so that we could get new warrants out. Well, of course, during this time, Gardner kept appealing to get bail, and we had a hard job trying to stop that. However, by the time I got back to New Zealand, got the warrants, flew back to England again, they were about to let him out of the prison, but of course Scotland Yard jumped on him and served our new warrants on him. So we had then opportunity to lock him up and try him again.
Okay, and then at some point it's decided that he's going to come back to New Zealand, right?
Yes. Well, of course, Gardner being Gardner and had the wherewithal to do things, he started to appeal, and he appealed to the House of Lords. And of course, that was, the first time that our police had been to the House of Lords on a crime in England. And the whole thing with that also is the cost all started to blow out. We had a budget of, I think it's about £400, and now we're up to £10,000 because we had to hire specialist lawyers in England to deal with the courts there. But as I said previously, we managed to navigate all those situations, and finally we got the okay to bring him back to New Zealand.
Yeah, but that wasn't the end of it because he didn't want to come on a plane.
No, he didn't want to fly, but he came up with an alternative and said, look, how about I'll go on ship and I'll pay your fare also first class if you allow me to come back on the ship.
He promised to pay your fare?
Yes, he promised to pay my fare out as well. Then he sort of offered me a bribe and said, we could get this through all right. But I said, no, Sonny, I'm sorry. There's only one way back and we're going to fly. But of course, what was happening all the time, I couldn't get fares on airlines because they didn't want to be held up through a process that he could serve on them to stop the plane from flying.
Right.
Because he said he had an illness, and he even got a doctor to give him a certificate to say he couldn't fly. So things were getting pretty difficult at about this time. So I got hold of my boss back in New Zealand, and they decided to send Detective Inspector Perry over to help me to get him out of the country.
Yeah.
But as things turned out, the courts ruled in my favour and said that we could fly him. Well, with many of the airlines not wanting to take us, what actually happened, we finally found that British Airways were prepared to fly us. And the reason they were prepared to fly us is because they had just brought Ronald Biggs back from Brazil earlier in the year, and they got a lot of publicity out of it. And they said to us, look, Joe, we don't mind more publicity. We'll take you wherever you want to go. Well, that was one part of the problem, but the other part of the problem was he was wanted in so many countries we couldn't land there. So we had to take an unusual route home, which went through Germany and up into Mumbai and across to, finally, I think we finished up in Hong Kong before we could get back to New Zealand.
Because you're worried you might touch down one of these places and they'd say, oh, we've got some business with this guy. We're going to keep him here.
Oh, absolutely, because he had no passport, you see. And, of course, any country could have snatched him, particularly the ones where he was wanted on crimes that he had committed previously.
You got him back, though, and what was his sentence back here in New Zealand?
Well, he was charged with 19 counts of obtaining money by false pretences and fraud, and he was sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment, which probably was around about a reasonable sentence for that time when offences were committed.
Yeah. You must have got to know him a bit over all that time.
Yes, he was an unusual character, but he was a typical fraudster. And, con men, they always think they have a superior intellect. They think that their brain will always carry them through whatever they're doing, and they're in that category which they don't drop their guard, and they dress well and present well. They use top-shelf hotels and name drop. They seek media attention to promote their scheme. But, usually corrupt people, after a while, their ego lets them down and they try to run and make off with the cash.
Wow.
Now, Gardner, interestingly, he left school at the age of 14 years. He spoke 4 languages, and most of his funds that he had prior to coming to New Zealand were locked up in Swiss bank accounts. And he also had another prostitute controlling those. So he was quite a smart operator.
Did it feel good to put him away?
Well, yes. It was another fraudster out of the system, which was the main thing. And, of course, the pattern of business, hasn't really changed. And fraudsters take the time to just study these new ventures. And there were things like in the 70s when there was a transition from hard copy accounting to computers. Many scammers took advantage of this. Then there were Ponzi schemes. Then in the 90s there was also the barcoding schemes which fraudsters found loopholes in. And now we're into the 2000s. Of course, we've got the cryptocurrencies, and then we've got the ransomware, where you freeze the computer and hold the company for hostage.
Yeah, you've kept up with all the latest scams, have you, Robert? I presume you're retired these days.
Oh, yes, I'm well retired. But, of course, the scams haven't really changed since Eve took the apple and gave it to Adam and said it's okay. But, of course, you can remember what happened to them. They both got kicked out of paradise, as the Bible tells us.
Whatever happened to Robert Gardner when he got out of prison? Did you follow his, let's call it, career?
After he was released from prison in in New Zealand, he was extradited to Australia. Unfortunately, he was given bail there. That was the last he was seen of in Australia.
Wow.
He turned up in Santiago in South America. One night, they locked him up in his prison cell, but next morning the cell was empty, and he hadn't been traced again.
Wow.
There'd been certain suspicions that he'd been mixed up, of course, with other criminals, and could have finished up in Canada or wherever, I don't know.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Crimes NZ, and a big thanks to Joseph Sheehan for such an interesting yarn. Crimes NZ is hosted by me, Jesse Mulligan, and produced by Melita Tull, Charlie Drever, Sam Hollis and Ayana Piper-Helian. This week, Charlotte Ryan interviewed our guests. Crimes NZ, the podcast, is put together by Liz Garton, and the executive producer of RNZ Podcasts is Tim Watkin. Follow Crimes NZ on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find your podcasts.